Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today I'm talking to Linda Lang. And Linda Lang, her day job is as a multifamily capital markets executive coordinator professional. And she's working at Freddie Mac in the state of Virginia in the US. So for those who don't know it, Freddie Mac is a company that provides support to mortgage lenders. But I'm not talking to Linda about her day job. I'm talking to her about something completely different, which is the work that she's doing in the fight against human trafficking. So welcome, Linda.
Yes. Hi, Cecilia. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to talk to you and have this conversation today.
So, Linda, let's start off by just getting clear on what is human trafficking.
Sure. Well, human trafficking is a large umbrella and it falls on two predominantly categories. One is human sex trafficking, and the other one's labor trafficking. And both occurs when someone uses force, fraud, or coercion to cause either labor or commercial sex acts with an adult or a minor to commit either sexual acts or labor services. So it encompasses that. Mainly the work that I pretty much bring awareness to in the United States, specifically in Virginia, which is the DC metropolitan area, is the Commercial Sex Act. That's the one that we've seen most prevalent in this area. However, the labor ones do exist with migrants and immigrants. We have seen that a lot. And just so that we can even define what a Commercial Sex Act is, what it includes prostitution, pornography, sexual performances done in exchange for an item of value, like money, drugs, shelter, or food and clothes. So the big thing and the underlining thing that when we think about trafficking a human, we think of it's predominantly when it's against your will, when there's force and fraud and coercion. And that's something that definitely, it makes the difference of when we're thinking about that. And it's mainly defined between 18 and younger, but then we've also seen human trafficking with 18 and above. And we'll probably get into that a little bit later, but that's how predominantly there's two ways. There's the sex trafficking and the labor trafficking.
Okay, so there's part that's to do with basically things that are related to prostitution. And,
correct.
And there's part about just having to work in a way that's not what you would normally choose to do.
Yes. And a lot of it is pretty much they're tricked. So we can get into that as you ask the questions. Yes, absolutely. And this is a worldwide, I know we're in a pandemic, but this is a worldwide kind of pandemic.
So how big is the problem in human trafficking?
Human trafficking, there's a lot of statistics, and some of the statistics you'll see there's about another way of saying human trafficking is slavery, modern day slavery, because anything that's done out of someone's will, right? There's an estimated about 40 million in trafficking worldwide. Okay, and 60% of the victims are predominantly in Asia. There's different organizations that pull up these data, and 60% of it is in Asia. However, it's worldwide, and it reaches about 16 million victims in like the supply chains.
Wow, so it's not a small problem.
No, it's considered the third issue within the largest industry outside of drugs and arms. Mm-hmm. This is the third largest industry that it's growing across the world,
so it's actually even growing.
Yes, it's pretty staggering, and it's $150 billion industry like $150 million, where this transaction of human is happening every single day across the world, which is, I when I think about the numbers, it's like, it's staggering. I mean, you think drugs an issue, it is, which is an issue worldwide. And then you have the arms, and it is an issue, but this is an issue, and it continues to grow.
So, what's the sort of person? I mean, how does somebody become a victim of human trafficking? How does it play out?
I would say this. I mean, anyone's vulnerable. There's traffickers. There's like obviously the victim, right? There's a slave victim. There are the traffickers, which are called the pimps. And there's different types of pimps and traffickers. And then there are the buyers, right? And those are typically called the Johns. So how does someone get involved? It's obviously no one's out there saying, "Hey, I want to get involved." But traffickers have an eye for vulnerable women and children, and just between the youngest trafficker right now, and at least for the U.S., and I'm sure it gets younger and younger across the world, is 12 to 14 years old. Okay, and so some of these
the people who are doing the trafficking. So the pimp is
the victims are young.
The victims,
and then some traffickers are teenagers. So traffickers know how to target vulnerable children or vulnerable people. For example, they're when the runaways, people who look isolated, who look downcast, either at least here in the U.S., like in the malls, metro stops, schools, libraries, anywhere where there's a young woman who looks kind of isolated or discouraged, pimps go out and they target, they groom these women with love and promises. And that's how it works. And predominantly, when you think about it, when I analyze it globally and even locally and even nationally in my part, like in the North American region, it all is based on money, right? These traffickers want money because it's typically, when you see it, it's a high yield with low risk. And why do I say that? It's super lucrative for the trafficker. And when they spot these women, they lure them in with these false promises, with these grandiose things. And as women, when we are either a runaway or out alone with our girls, we're definitely vulnerable. And these traffickers know how to target and look for them. When they don't look at you in the eye, it's like, oh, okay, we got someone who's a little bit vulnerable. Like they can target women who lack a little bit of confidence. And that's what we've seen here. And there's so many different other ways that it happens, though, because some traffickers are parents. We've seen that, and it's all because of money. They want money. And because the laws, for example, in Virginia, human trafficking became against the law just in 2015.
Oh, my goodness.
So, and that's what I mean with low risk. Yeah, it's low risk. Like you can get away with it. That's why you have a high return. Think about it. You can use one body, and they charge, who knows, between 200, depending on the country, between 200 and about thousands of dollars for one person. And you can repeat for one person over and over. Just add the numbers. It's super lucrative. That's why there's a high yield and low risk, because there's no accountability. There's no laws. And typically, victims are targeted as prostitutes, and there's laws against prostitution, but not against traffickers and pimps and Johns. So this perpetuates the ongoing issue. I mean, it's incredible that right now there's 1 in 4 traffic victims are children. They're getting younger and younger.
When you say children, you mean under 18 or even younger than
under
that?
18, like grade school. There's been, and then it has different forms, right? Some of them it is something that's been growing during the pandemic and lockdowns is the cyber child pornography. That's been growing. So it's just a booming business, and people just love that. And they use vulnerable children, women, and even men. I mean, predominantly 71% of these victims are women and girls. However, we're seeing a lot of young men as well being trafficked, and young children, boys being trafficked. So it's definitely an issue that it's extremely complex. Every country, every region, and there's different, like I've said a little bit earlier, because there's two types, and each, they come in different forms, shapes, and sizes, and how they get lured in. But it's definitely like some type of vulnerability that happens. Undocumented immigrants, like in the U.S. or other countries, right? People who are vulnerable, who are in need of some kind of something like money, and so they get hooked into doing like a service. Either it could be labor, and then their identity is taken away, like their passports or whatever is taken away, and then there's that hook, right? There's that attachment trauma that happens, that now they're stuck. They have no resources. So you see that there's this lack of information flows when there's a traffic victim. And I always see what the underlying thing here is: fear, right? It's a fear tactic, that force, coercion. It's definitely fear-based. It's a tactic to make yourself dependent on the trafficker, right? And when you don't have an identity. So I think that's how people get hooked. And then when there's vulnerable people and someone's providing a service, for example, I had a colleague who her mother trafficked her between the ages of 8 and 12. Why did the mom, someone that's supposed to have your back, provide security and protect you? Because the mom needed money. And the only way to have money is to sell her child over and over to, and then a lot of these children also come from families who do drug abuse. And then some of them don't. We've seen people who which drug and alcohol addiction do kind of foster this potential victim. However, we've seen kids in middle to high-end neighborhoods because their parents are working all the time and there's no supervision with the young child or teenager. A lot of what we see here, and especially in my county, Fairfax County, is these teenagers who go out with their girlfriends at bus stops, or like at the metro. We have this, the rail, the train transportation system that we have here, and then the malls or the movie theaters, when we're able to have movie theaters. It's just ways that traffickers know. Also something huge with trafficking, when people don't realize where trafficking is very active and transactions are happening. Super Bowl, like our anywhere where there's a large amount of people in one place, trafficking is there. And people would be surprised of the people buying it. They're typically high-end people. They're people that look like you and normal people. They're people who have leaders in the faith community and politics. Like I said, they're even our uncles and our cousins and fathers. It's a real issue.
And when you say that there's trafficking going on, does that mean that there are people who are pimps who are looking to pick up vulnerable people, or does it mean that there's...
Okay. What was the other question? Because it could be both.
or it's people who are looking for looking for prostitutes or for to buy the services.
Yeah, the second part is there's the Johns, what we call Johns, people who buy the services. So the Johns, the people buying the services, can look like so many people that we look up to in politics and our faith communities. It's really, really discouraging. People that we look up to as role models in the sport arenas are traffickers, are buying the services. And there's traffickers. I mean, traffickers, they typically don't have one person they're trafficking. They have like multiple women and children, because that's why it's so lucrative, and that's why people stay. And you think, what's going on? I'm like, oh, anyways.
So is the trafficking, is it actually finding somebody, grooming somebody, and then selling them on to somebody else? Or is it finding them, grooming them, and then using them as, keeping them as part of your cohort, which you then sell their services out?
Yeah, it's all what you said. Some of them, the traffickers they brand them either with tattoos or like how branding happens with animals. We have like a hard coal and then you brand them, and they know who you're from, who you're with, who you're, like we said, your cohort. And actually, the traffickers, also known as pimps, they actually do trade and buy women if they want to. The highest bidder. It's everything's all transactional. That's how traffickers see it. It's all a business for them. It's not exploitation of women, nothing like that. They don't care about the child. They don't care about their well-being. A lot of these women and girls and children actually don't go to their annual checkups. They don't have medical services or assistance, because for the trafficker, it's all about making that money and making more money. Once you see how lucrative, it's about how do we get more of that. And then, and some of them, and a lot of the victims, because of the trauma bonding that happens, they don't leave. And sometimes they don't want to leave. There's women who escape and leave, which is very difficult to do. But sometimes they go back because that's the life that they know. And they don't self-identify as a human trafficking victim. So it's even hard to identify what that looks like, because they don't identify. There was one a survivor that I know who's very, I guess, renowned in the human trafficking, Rebecca Bender. She actually thought that her boyfriend at the time, her trafficker, had an alcohol issue and a drug issue, and she just had a sexual behavior issue. She never put two and two together, that she was actually a sex trafficking victim, which is kind of interesting. And I think a lot of it has to do with that trauma bond, but also the lack of awareness that we have all across the world. And then the lack of laws, right? I mean, a lot of the trafficking survivors are coming out and are doing these nonprofits to bring more awareness to law enforcement, to politicians, for advocacy, to state and local officials, to hotels, to, I think I said police enforcement agencies. They're training them how to spot them and how to do test kits, because a lot of them lie. They have to lie because some of the victims, for example, are vulnerable. The traffickers target single moms with young children, anywhere where they can bribe them and say, if you don't come back, then we're going to kill your child or we're going to do this to your family. So there's that fear. It's interesting. It's all fear-based. And so they comply out of fear and they stay. And that's why they keep coming back. They can't leave. They're tied.
Tell me about the trauma bonding and what are the psychological effects of being a victim of human trafficking?
Well, you don't have an identity. It's kind of like it's like a little bit like domestic violence, right? You don't really see that you're a victim. You just see that, wow, okay, something's not right, but it's not. So there's that high dependency on the trafficker at all times. It's like, it's like this repeated trauma that your mind and your psyche has to stay in to think that you're alive. Because some of them, if they don't comply, they get beaten. So then they just become, like robots. And a lot of them, because they try to numb their pain, they get a lot into drugs and alcohol to numb it, or just to numb the fact that they're being trafficked every day. And so they become addicts. So it's interesting. They submit to the fear of the trafficker, but then they rely heavily on substance abuse to numb themselves. So if you can imagine, like all the trauma that's going on sexually, it's like your body is being raped over and over every day because you can't say no. It's not up to you to say no. You're not. You're an object. You're a commodity to the trafficker. So basically, you don't have an identity. And that to me is like, that's what bothers me the most as a human being. Like someone is stripped of their identity. They can't think for themselves. They're so reliant on fear and abuse and rape. And your mind then shuts down. And sometimes they're like living zombies. And a lot of, I follow and I try to meet survivors because some of them die, some of them are killed, and some of them don't want to live anymore. And so I try to follow them just because I want to learn from them. They're so inspiring to me, that the fact that they got out. A lot of them. So the trauma bond, obviously, there's a psychological dependency on something else, but then there's also because they don't get medical attention, like and sometimes it happens so young. There's some of the women's organs are not fully developed, so there's a lot of internal damage, physical damage inside their organs or their private area, reproductive areas, and some of them have horrible pain. And then even for young boys, since it's mainly, it could be like, I mean, I'm just going to be very, it could be anal sex. So any type of sex produced from either the younger or the boy, there's a lot of damage and a lot of internal that does not get medical attention. So a person that's supposed to be living out their strength and living out their purpose in life, because we're all created to live out our purpose, and we're creative creatures, right? To create and produce good. But then these victims are so just not given the opportunity to live out what they're supposed to live. And in fact, it's trauma, daily trauma, emotional, psychological, physical trauma. So it's really, it's very challenging. And the fact that the numbers of victims are increasing because there's demand for it.
So I want to come back. I want to come back to a couple of things. First of all, is how do people manage to get out? And the second thing I'd like to ask is about the demand and where the demand is coming from and what we can do about the demand.
Sure. How do people get out? It's very challenging to get out, and it varies from story to story. People have gotten out, for example, when there's training airplane, like flight attendants. They see signs, so they report it. It can be like that, or they're getting perhaps like a victim has been beaten and they need medical attention. It's kind of like, and you want your
commodity
to get good. Well.
Yeah.
And so they do, but then they don't have an identity. They lie. And sometimes nurses and like the emergency or first responders medically, that's why the training for them is really important to spot the signs. And then you can call. Same thing with law enforcement. When you stop somebody, you have to know what questions to ask, and then hopefully you can get out. Obviously, if you're younger, it's harder to get out. But there are ways where you can spot. That's why I feel like training and bringing awareness is key to different people. Like in the hotel industry, you have to, training the cleaning people, all the people to identify to be able to get out. Sometimes because a lot of them end up in jail because of prostitution, quote unquote. Sometimes they'll open up at that time. We're being trafficked.
So jail can actually be a savior for them.
Yes, it could be. But because there's no laws of certain states against it, then sometimes they're just, they get charged and the trafficker goes set free because there's no law against trafficking in certain places. So that's why it's like so confusing. So sometimes that's how it's so hard. That's why the risk is so low and why people can't leave. And then it gets harder and harder for children. They're the most vulnerable. They don't know these resources. They don't know what to say. So it is very
they probably don't even know that it's not normal.
Correct. They've been so conditioned to this is normal for them. This is life. You came into the world for this. Yes. So it's hard. And then there's a organization where this guy, he used to be a former FBI agent somewhere I think he was, and he was doing an operation staying in Haiti and saw children, two as young as one. His heart was so moved that he talked to his wife, and they did the operational thing successfully. They rescued about 21 children, and him and his wife adopted two. And then they so happened to be brother and sister. So it's like, I don't know. It's like, how do they get, it doesn't, I mean, with children, it gets very sticky and very challenging. That it was just, I believe in divine appointments. I believe, like, how do you explain that? Why do these children get picked and not the others? I don't know. It's just it's a very hard thing to swallow.
Mm. And I want to come to the demand in a second, but before that, who are the people who are doing the trafficking, the pimps and the Johns? You say that they're just in it for the money. What sort of profiles do they have? Because I find it so difficult to imagine people who are so divorced from their own humanity.
Correct.
So it just intrigues me that how do people do that?
It varies. I know that a lot of traffickers, you think in this area, there's a lot of gangs. So men who are in gangs do that. But however, it can be business people. You would just never understand how normal even the traffickers as well as the pimps are. But you do see some, predominantly what the sex traffickers are. But and like in this area, they're definitely, because we have a high percentage of gangs in this area, that's mainly where it comes from. But it can be anybody. Like we said a little bit earlier, even parents, because there's a need for something. You see a lot in Asia. A lot of the parents in Asia sell their children for that because they need money. So it's just, I don't think there's a one type of person. It's just anybody who, in my personal opinion, has no conscience for a human being, a heart. Because how can someone, like a human being, think that's okay? So there's got to be some kind of searing of your conscience of right and wrong, right? And I think it's a very so instead of saying like, what does it look like? Because it varies. I've also I've seen documentaries of former pimps, of former traffickers, and they just do it for the money. So it's not really what they look like on the outside, is more what's on the inside, right? The greed. And they can come all shapes and sizes. It's the greed, the want to make more money for other reasons, right? To make them feel successful. Maybe they were someone who weren't successful, like gang members, right? They just don't probably didn't feel connection in their own family unit, and they have this identity with these gangs, and now it's like, oh, now we can make money, and it's fun because they make it a lifestyle. Okay, and as much as they can be abusive, and they're definitely obviously controlling to their victims, but they make it a lifestyle. They go to parties, they go to nightclubs. They try to treat them well. It's like they're trying to, continue to groom their commodity as much as they can to be lively and to be desirable to the buyer. So there's definitely a disconnect. There's a disconnect that I would like to see psychologically what that disconnect is. But we know it's very self-centered. It's a narcissistic type of personality because it's all about self, more so than the clothes or the titles we hold in society. It's a very self-centered, egocentric type of personality that would want to do that, who has no regard for human life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so the people who are using these services, I would imagine that it's in a way it's the same sort of a person, because they're not understanding the effects of what they're doing. They just don't care.
Yeah, they don't care. I mean, there's people in America. Mainly the consumers are mainly in the U.S. Okay, and they fly out to Asia to go and find services with young children. Which, how would you fly all the way across the country, like not even the country, the world? You would think that during the flight there would be some conscious, like, this is wrong. There's a disconnect, and to me, when I evaluate this, is there's a disconnect with the soul. And when I think about a soul, I think about that's your thoughts, your emotions, and your will. And there's a disconnect with the soul, with the human soul, when that happens, because your thoughts would tell you, and your conscience would say, you shouldn't abuse a young child, right? And why are you buying services? Like there's just a disconnect with the soul, and so that's where there's a lot of work to be done in our world. As this industry is growing, you start to think like, what's going on with our world? And I think it's the soul. Bottom line is, what are we choosing as individuals, collectively, in our cultures and regions around the world, countries, counties, however you're divided, what's influencing our minds, what's influencing our emotions, so that, or the lack of, right, that we're acting out in ways that are not human. And I think bottom line is, that we become very self-elevated in so many ways. So for not for good. I mean, you can have some self-reflection and curiosity of self, but when it's just hungry for what you want, your sexual appetite, your sexual desires, or your business wanting to grow, or for your ego to increase, and there's an issue with that.
So what do you think needs to be done about trafficking?
Oh man, there's a lot of things that needs to be done. I love the different nonprofits that I will share with you. All the different organizations that are doing. There needs to be laws
in the show notes. Yeah.
I mean, there needs to be laws. I mean, laws, right? We need to have at a national, local levels. For us in the U.S. is like our federal and state level laws against it. And then just bringing awareness. I mean, awareness, it goes a long way. For example, like I try to bring awareness to corporate America because I initially wanted to mentor the survivors, teenage survivors in the area. There's a home, a transitional home that we have in the area. And I really wanted to do that. But when I was doing the training, I realized, wow. And I was a first-time mom. I was pregnant with my second child. And I realized how much emotional involvement it would be, that I'm like, I can't do that now because of the involvement that I have with my children and being a first-time mom or second-time mom. So my strategy of helping changed. That's why I was like, you know what we can do is bring awareness. If that's the only one thing, whether it be one person, I thought, let me bring awareness to where I work. I spend most of my days there. So I just figured it out. I connected to the people that were, in my, in my company, to see how we can launch this training for our employees. And that's what I've been doing probably for the last seven years. And it's been so rewarding because I'm able to bring this type of information to masses of people. And once I make those deposits, I call them like little seeds, right? People want to respond. And so that's where I'm like, oh, here's some resources. Here's these organizations. There's so many things you can do at the local level, at the national level, and at the government level. So I think how do we, there's so many levels of how to get involved. I think it's getting individuals, as an individual, deciding just to learn and to educate yourself of what it looks like and what it looks like in your area. Because it may look different from where I live and where you're at, Cecilia, or somewhere in Asia or in South America and Central America. It just may look different in Europe. It just looks different. However, there's organizations that are actively trying to eradicate this modern day slavery. So there's just a couple things. There's so many things, so many other things that can be done. So, and then act responsibly, right? If you see something, that's why it's so important to get connected to these organizations, nonprofits, because they're experts. They become experts. And as much as you want to take that child away from the trafficker, there's certain laws and things that you can't. We think it's easy, but it's not as easy. So that's why it's so important to get you educated, not just on the issue, but how to resolve the issue, right? Like how to get involved. If use your own natural talents. I mean, Cecilia, you have a podcast. So what did you do? You heard this, boom, you're making awareness. Use your own way that you're skilled, and people like bloggers write about it. go donate. I mean, a lot of these nonprofits run because off of donations. So if that's the way you can help, then just donate, because there's people there, volunteers who are dedicated to do this. People, for example, they ways to collect funds, at least in northern and our area, is we do galas. And some people like, how do we get involved? Well, there's a photographer who gave their free services for the gala members to make it fun. There's so many different ways. Those little ways that you think are insignificant are huge to fight against human trafficking. So you can volunteer, you can mentor. I mean, you can donate your time, your ideas. You can schedule a speaker to your workplace, to your religious institution. You can support your state and federal legislature. If you want to fight against policy and advocacy, it's just so many things you can do.
I want to come back to what you said about the nurses and doctors and people who, and the police officers, and the sorts of questions that they need to ask. What sort of questions would they be?
Oh gosh, there are different questions. Sometimes, for example, for a police officer, when you make a stop, sometimes you kind of see there's an older man and a young child in the car. That's why ID is important. And when they don't show ID, then that could be a potential red flag. Why does this person ID? And sometimes young children don't have an ID, but they may look different. So it just depends. Like, we have to be. So if a police officer knows something, they can kind of smell something's going on. They know the right questions to ask. For medical, sometimes there's like rape kits, and you can see the type of if the victim is very nervous. Obviously, you're going to be nervous in that situation anyway. But then there's types of bruises you can see. With the medical, the nurse, they can see types of bruises. They can ask questions about where they're staying and how they respond. Because there's certain levels when there's a lot of trauma, they're going to be more subdued. It's like they can pick it up. And we have hotlines in the US. We have national hotlines where we can report some suspicious activity, and then they can have the right people investigate. So there's clues that you can find out. But predominantly is you see the victim very scared, just in a different way scared. We all feel uncomfortable when we go to the OBGYN or we go to the doctors, right? But there's like an extreme type of nervousness, like they don't want to look, and the way they answer is not coherent. So when you start picking these things up, and the person perhaps that who brought them, so when you can start assessing the situation, you can actually perhaps identify what's going on, and then we have numbers that you can call. So it's so helpful for police officers, medical staff to know what to look for. What are the signs? Because that can save a life. That can really save a child's life or a woman's life, a girl's life.
Linda, I wanted to ask you, how did you initially become involved? What was it why was it you that became interested in human trafficking? What was it in your childhood, in your past, in your history?
Yeah, thank you for that question, because we're all kind of a reflection of our past. So I would say, why did I get involved in like human trafficking? Because as a young child, my voice was taken away because I was sexually molested several times by different people, either a family member or family members that were close to my family. Because we were in Latin America, where we always do things in numbers, like, community is huge. So when that happened, and the first time it happened, it was when I was 4 years old. And the last time that I recall happening was when I was like 9 or 10 years old. And so just remembering that, the fear that I felt, I remember wanting to talk to my mother what happened. So I knew it was wrong. I just didn't know it was wrong because it's never happened to me. And so I feel like grooming at that age can happen, right? Your psyche can say that it's your fault, And then so I didn't realize that had an effect on me until I was in late in my teens, because I had really good mentors, and they spotted some signs in me, because I had my former roommate and really good mentor. she studied psychology. And she was like, Linda, have you thought of it? Because she saw like my lack of trust. I would pull back. My relationship with men weren't like, I was like very hesitant and apprehensive, and I had trust. And she picked it up. And so she just gently would tell me like, hey, have you ever thought of getting some therapy, like talk therapy? It's not bad. And in my culture, talk therapy is not something that you do. It's just looked at, oh, it's only for people who have mental illnesses. And so I was always weary with that. But you know what? The more I thought about it, I was like, I do, and I want to get better. And then during around that same time, I was involved with a nonprofit that actually helped rape victims in Uganda be kind of reassessed and what's the right word? Like to help them to be productive citizens in their society, because they were raped by the LRA army, the Lord's Rebel Army in Uganda, and they had these unwanted children. And so that was maybe like 15 years ago or more. I started seeing that connection, and I was like, oh my gosh, like their lives were taken away. Like and then I connected everything where I was like, oh my gosh. And it's like, I wasn't raped, but I know what it feels like to be sexually molested and assaulted in ways that you didn't want. And what that did to me, it muted me. It took away my voice because I lived in fear and uncomfortable around certain people, and I didn't trust people. And then when I started learning about these other women, and then because of this organization, I would go to different conferences, and then that's what I started to learn about trafficking. And it wasn't just in the movies and the documentaries, it was happening in my home state. And I was like, how can this be possible? And this is in my early 20s, or my early to mid 20s. I'm in my early 40s now. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it. So I decided to self-educate and connect with professionals, experts, and then started going to Survivor. Any time when there was a Survivor, I was like, I can't believe this was happening. And then because of, I was like, oh my gosh, I had perspective in terms of, wow, I can't imagine what a woman feels like to be raped every day, to go against their will, like to be trapped. I couldn't imagine that trauma. I had a little bit of trauma and how that affected me all my life. And I was like, oh my gosh. Then I don't know if because I'm a Libra, I was born in October, I have a sense of justice. And then I was like, you know what? I need to get involved. And so that's how I got involved, because I saw how it affected me so much. And that was like something so small. And then when I learning about all these women, children being coerced, forced to have sex with people they didn't want to, I was like, I need to do something. So it just did something in me. And I felt like, though I don't completely understand what it means to go through what they're going through, I can do something about it, because if in that small way it shut me up, I can't imagine. And so I'm a person who loves to see people live out their purpose and live out from their natural innate abilities and strengths. So that to me, it's like if another human being is stopping from that person to live out their full potential, I want to do something about it, because I'm like, that's not right. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of in a nutshell how I got involved and why.
It's very, and I find it very, very touching, actually, that that your experience, that your small experience made you be able to relate to what these other women are going through, women and children are going through, and some men. And that's what galvanized you into action.
Yeah. And sometimes I think we have to remember that as human beings, right? It can be small pain points, but that could be something that will drive you to do good in this world.
And how is it being involved in the campaign against human trafficking? How has that changed you?
Wow, it's bringing me a lot more awareness. It just shows how vulnerable human beings can be. It's changed me. I mean, I just want to get more and more involved. It just shown me that we have a lot of work to do in the world, right? Because this is a growing issue. It's not diminishing. As much as we want to end it, it's actually growing. So it's actually, opened up my eyes to see that our world needs a lot of healing and a lot of help. There's organizations actually. In the beginning, I just get so angry with the traffickers and the buyers, the Johns. But there's actually organizations that actually help, especially the buyers. Like, what's the disconnect? They're actually out there trying to help them. Like, what's going on in you? So in some sense, not that I have just the how fickle the human heart and mind and soul can be, but at the same time, how with help and resources, even a John can turn his ways and stop doing it and stop being part of the problem. So I've seen even that, because initially I was so angry with the men. I just amplified my anger towards men because as a child, it was my cousin, it was my dad's friend. It was like the men in my life were doing harm. And as an adult, I'm like, why are men, like, one, buying it, and two, why are they trafficking? Like, what's going on? So it has made me like think about, wow, they need help as well. The victims need help. However, the men need a lot of help because they're the ones buying it. And it's predominantly men.
Yeah, I'm actually, and on this podcast, I've interviewed a lot of people who are involved in domestic violence, in sexual abuse of children. Somebody who's talking in Madagascar about how it's just violence against women is just endemic. That sexual abuse of young girls is endemic. And what it makes me come away thinking is, what is happening to the men? How something is so, as you say, that what is causing the disconnect?
Sure.
That they're losing their humanity, that they can think that it's normal and natural to be doing these things. And that's where the focus needs to be.
Yeah.
That if you can't get the men to be changing the way that they think about things, and perhaps I wonder also it's about status. And it's, as you said before, it's often the weaker gang members, that it's men who feel like they really need to have status, and this is a way of them getting status, and that we need to be working on some other way of men getting status.
Yeah. And that's what has kind of taught me, like, there's a lot of work to do with men, young men. And with my young, I have 2 young children, 9 and 6 boys. Like, I really try to train them to respect women at all costs, in small ways, like, still trying to be chivalrous, like open the door for them, be gentle with them, like be gentle with grandma. Or we have one, my mother-in-law live with us. So she has early stages of dementia. So I try to train them like, hey, just forgive her. She's losing her mind, just be gentle with the elderly. So I always try to show my boys. And even today, my 9-year-old, he read, because we're teaching him about sex, because we want them to learn the home. And he read child sex trafficking. And he's like, why would sex and children be on the same sentence?
Oh my goodness.
And this happened just this morning, right before.
Oh my goodness me.
And then I was like, honey, remember how I tell you how I don't want you to be in those games Among Us, or there's an Among Us, there's a Roblox. That's how, I remember I told you there's mean people in the world who want to abuse innocent people. Well, when you get a little bit older, I'll start telling you about what's happening in the world, and how I want you to be a role model, and I want you to be a young man who values people. And and he's like, yeah, Mom. And he kept thinking, because he just couldn't find why sex and children will be in that same. He's like, child sex trafficking. I'm like, yes,
honey. He's so right. He's so right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's given me new ideas too, because I'm like partnering up with men who are role models in our society, and go after these young minds, because they're so influential and they want to be loved just as we want to be loved. We're human, right? We all want to be loved and cared for and noticed and purpose. So I think it's, there's a lot of work to be done with men as well. So
absolutely, yeah. Linda, I'm coming to my last question.
Yes.
The first thing I wanted to ask you is, what's the bravest thing you've done in your life?
I mean, that's a good question. I thought about it when you asked me that prior, and I think it's relative to each person, right? And for me, is actually opening up about what happened to me as a child, because I was so muted and I was so afraid, thinking that I will be less loved by my parents if I told them, that I would be looked differently by my friends if I opened up. And so talking about that I was molested, I mean, that took me being like in my mid-20s, or even early 30s to feel comfortable and I feel like I'm sweating, like knowing that that was something that happened to me that I had no control of. But just that trauma, when you're sexually assaulted, one act, even if it was only happened one time, there's long-term consequences with that one act of forced, coerced, or unwanted touching or unwanted anything. And so that muted me. So I think one of the bravest things I've done is talk to specifically my parents about it. And I didn't do that. I didn't talk to my parents about that until I got married, and I got married in my early 30s. So I think that, because when I can talk about it, and even though I'm sweating and it's uncomfortable, and I'm like, what are they going to think? They're going to think that I was luring them, but then thinking back, I would never want to, I mean, it's not in a child's mind to lure sexually an adult, but then it's interesting so that was the bravest thing I'd done, because I remember how it affected me. I would, want to play sports and want to be one of the boys and dress like the boys. I didn't know that that's what I was doing until I was an adult, looking back in hindsight, that I just didn't want to be sexually abused anymore or sexually wanted. So when I started talking about it, even like now talking about it, this is just, the more I talk about it, it's more like, wow, I'm getting braver and braver, because it is a piece of me that I don't want this to happen to anybody. And if it's happening, how do we find solutions to free the victims, to educate the traffickers and the Johns, just to because we have to get better in our world. So I would say that would be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is incredibly brave. And I also think that the more I do this podcast, that it's incredibly common, that it's happened to so many people. And so I think that the fact that you're able to speak out about it will then give other people the courage to also speak out about it and to seek help and to realize that what happened to them is not normal, and that it's not their fault.
Correct.
It's absolutely not their fault.
And I think that's empowering, right? When you bring it into the world, I think anything related to fear is like information is closed off, right? Even your own, like it's closed off. And that's how fear can still have a grip on you when there's no information flowing in and out from one person to another. But the more we talk about it and have that verbal transaction, right? It becomes freer. And that's why talk therapy, or talking to your parents, or talking to mentors and counselors and therapists, or whoever you talk with, if you have a small group or even people like you, it gives you one more layer of freedom and confidence. And then you have your voice and your purpose again.
Another question is,
Sure.
What's been the impact on your life and on your career of being a woman, positive or negative?
Oh, just being a woman in general? Like a woman. Oh, wow. Yeah. I think I probably operate more in terms of my assertiveness, what you typically associate, right? Typically operate more like a guy in terms of like, I'm a logical thinker. And however, just like the typical things, that's not seen favorably in a woman. But then I have to stay true to myself. That's how I am. I have innate qualities that made me this way, but also my environment shaped me as well. So there's two things that are shaping me. So I can't stop being who I am because it's not accepted in my culture. So I'm still who I am, because I always tell my friends, like, I think people would see me differently and see if I was a guy, they would probably, it would just be different. I think it would be. However, I don't let that consume my mind. I always try and find different avenues. And sometimes it has been stopped my advancement in my career. However, I started to look at things differently in terms of how I can impact without a title. Because sometimes, I think I would be in a different title if I was a guy with my same qualities. But I don't let that stop me, because I still try to make an impact and influence people in this way. And I'm involved in other things as well. This is one of my big things that I'm involved in. But I do everything that I'm involved in has to do with people and making people better. So I do find ways that even though I may not have the title, it doesn't stop me from getting to where I want to be. But I still am. I am who I am, and that's not going to stop me. Like I always tell people and people that I mentor, is like, people can take away your title and your job, but they will never take away your character. So work on your character first, and never stop working on your character. Always pursue your dreams and advancement, but no one can take away your character. So that's what I tell myself constantly.
And maybe that is your message. But if there was something that you'd learned from your life and that you can transmit to people who are listening, what would that message be?
I would say be curious about yourself. Of things that have happened to you, kind of like with me. Like I had to be curious of like, why do I respond the way that I responded? And don't do life solo. You need other people, trusted people, right? People who really care about you. And it's easy to sift out as you get older and as you're seeing people who really have your back, because that's how I found growth, being curious about myself and having other people, like my roommate and former mentor, like when I was a teenager, she saw different signs, right? She was like, hey, she gave me guidance. Then it was one step and then other steps. And then just different steps on whatever goal or vision you have for your life. You have to be curious of who you are, so you know what you bring to the table. Because everyone has great strengths and abilities and talents, and you can develop skill, but we all have innate. We were born with strengths that we can put into practice today and make an impact. So use it. I mean, I know that people find purpose by identifying and having an assessment of yourself, so that you can give whatever you want to give to the world. And that's how you find purpose. So I think is be curious of yourself, connect with other people, and see where that leads you.
Mm.
And develop skills if you want to grow in something. But there's innately things in every single human being that can be used for purpose, even right now.
And so that's a huge message of hope.
Yep.
And Linda,
and that's what I try to bring.
Yeah.
I love bringing hope.
Yeah. I just wanted to acknowledge and reflect back to you that the work that you're doing, I think, is so incredibly important. And I think it's not something that's on our radar screens for a lot of us. It's, as you say, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, which most of us don't think about most of the time. And
we don't see it in the news.
You don't see it in the news. You don't see it in the news. And so I think you're doing incredible work, and I'm sure that you're having impacts on many, many, many lives, and you will continue to do so in the future. And I think that your sons are very lucky to have you as their mother.
Thank you.
So thank you for your time. I appreciate. It's been great.
Thank you, Cecilia. I appreciate your time and just your heart, just to bring awareness on your podcast. So thank you. Because you're also making a difference just by allowing me to share these words and then later sharing the resources. So thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you for those words. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen, and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.